Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. I see some old friends. Gus Brito from Monterrey. Thank you for being here, Gus. Mayor Ocaña. Slacody, thank you. I want to begin by thanking the RGV Rail Advocates for inviting me to speak here with you today, provide a little bit of insights on my work in the legislature. As you've heard, I previously served as the chair of the House Committee on Transportation for 3 consecutive sessions. This is my 4th session serving on the Transportation Committee, but I now chair the Transportation Committee that deals solely with funding. So in both roles, I fought to ensure that the Rio Grande Valley has a seat at the table for our region so it receives the necessary goods, jobs, and funding to create the jobs and the infrastructure that connects our region with the rest of Texas and the world. So I want to start with providing you all with a bit of a recap of the most recent legislative session regarding rail policy. But more importantly, I want to focus on the critical aspect of our transportation future and how expanding and optimizing rail infrastructure can measurably enhance not only safety, but the entire transportation system. So can I switch slides for me, please? So this slide, this past legislative session came with some real wins for rail in Texas. Senate Bill 1555 by my colleague, Senator Nichols, allocates $250 million for railroad grade separation projects throughout the state. Now, that is not a lot of money, but it's something. And so opening the door and actually acknowledging the importance of rail, when we started doing some port funding, you've got ports across the United States, if their legislatures actually fund ports, we don't fund ports. And so the amount of economic effect when we actually put money into our ports, Texas ports are some of the most successful ports without the state funding. And so the same goes for rail. We should be investing in rail. And so this is a big win that we've actually got the legislature to acknowledge it, and we've got our foot in the door, or the camel's nose under the proverbial tent. The bill's focus is on rail grade separations for roads not managed by TxDOT, allowing cities and counties to pursue upgrades without competing with highway projects for funding in the future. TxDOT began a now closed call for projects in November 2025, with award determinations projected for the end of February 2026. We're here. I voted for this bill. The bill was initially referred to Transportation Funding Committee, but was called up and passed out of my committee for the full transportation vote. In the state budget, $40 million was appropriated for TxDOT. $860 million of that was carved out for rail, maritime, aviation, and public transportation. Another win and another acknowledgement that rail is the future. That's only 2% of the total transportation budget. What's important to recognize is the population is scheduled to double by 2050, and we cannot pave our way out of population growth. We've got people coming from all over the country, and they don't bring their roads with them. So in one of the most important pieces of legislation that also transpired last session, Senate Bill 2366 by Senator Hughes, this implements a short lane railroad grant program that creates a framework for future improvements for the first mile and the last mile of railroads. What this program will allow is grants to be administered by TxDOT's rail division for rural transportation districts as well as Class 2 and Class 3 railroads. The grant will go towards replacing tracks, bridges, increasing capacity, and restoring short line railroads. The program was not funded this session over some concerns that money would be tied to private entities and lack of oversight. But since the program has been set up, the future funding will be streamlined going forward. This bill passed on the local and consent calendar, which meant there was 0 opposition. And so that's an important aspect to know, that the House of Representatives had no sort of problem with moving forward with this idea and these policies. Finally, Senate Bill 2129 by Senator Johnson increases fines for motorists who disregard flagger warnings at railroad crossings. That fine grew from 100 to 400, which is an increase from the previous 50 to 200. Again, I voted for that bill because increasing public safety and making sure that railroad crossings are respected is actually very imperative to the future of Texas. This is slide 3. Texas has more freight rail mileage than any other state. That means we are the leader in freight rail mileage, with over 10,500 miles of track serving Class 1 short line carriers, moving hundreds of millions of tons of freight annually. In 2023 alone, freight railroads in our state originated and terminated hundreds of millions of tons of goods, including intermodal chemicals and bulk commodities, and that would otherwise have had to travel by truck and on our highways. For those of you who don't know, a fully loaded commercial 18-wheeler consumes the pavement at 10,000 times the rate of a normal vehicle. So when we talk about TxDOT funding the future, most of the funding is constitutionally dedicated to highways, and that's where we come into a funding problem in getting funding for rail and getting funding for mass transit, which in the future, there's going to have to be a change. There's just no way around it. But there's 200,000 lane miles in Texas, and those 200,000 lane miles Texas owns, has to maintain them and preserve them. And so when we talk about maintenance and preservation of the roads, you have to talk about pavement consumption. And pavement consumption is largely driven by large commercial vehicles. And if we got those large commercial vehicles off the roads and onto rail, we would be saving incredible, incalculable amounts of money. And so moving forward, we need to show and stand and say, the logic is there. You can't spend billions on the preservation and maintenance of roads that are being consumed by commercial vehicles when we have alternatives that would allow us not only to take many commercial vehicles off the road for safety reasons, but for economic reasons and for being good stewards of our tax dollars. It's imperative that we begin to recognize how important rail is. The rail movement equates to millions of truck trips taken off the highways every year, a direct reduction in exposure to collisions, roadway conflict points, and infrastructure, where one of rail's greatest safety advantages is structural, as you're aware, because trains run on dedicated, fully controlled right-of-ways. The crash rate per ton mile is significantly lower than any of those compared to trucks on highways. Can I get the next slide? Texas has more freight rail again than any other state. In 2023 alone, freight railroads in our state originated and terminated hundreds of millions of tons of goods. And that railroad expansion would increase and encompass making Texas a safer place to drive. If you're not aware, there has not been a fatality, a day without a fatality in, I want to say, 20 years. Texas has the longest streaks of deaths on highways. There's every single day people die in Texas. We have almost 4,000 deaths per year in Texas on the highways, and many of those collisions and many of those deaths are caused by commercial traffic. And so making sure that we recognize the full value of rail and the safety aspect is absolutely imperative. Slide 5, please. So, key freight corridors and highway challenges from the Texas Triangle encompassing I-35, I-45, and I-10 linking Dallas, Fort Worth, San Antonio, Austin, Houston to our international border connections, freight volumes are surging. I-45 corridor alone accounts for an outsized share of the freight movement within the triangle, with current volumes projected to more than double by 2050. I'll say that again, they're going to double by 2050. So you've got a population doubling and you've got your outsized freight movement between that triangle doubling. And so you can't have it all. And so one of the clear logical remedies is to invest in freight rail. I-10 remains a vital east-west freight artery linking El Paso, San Antonio, and Houston, carrying more freight by truck than any other mode in this corridor. It also remains the backbone of the north and south freight movement, and a choke point where highway congestion and heavy commercial traffic and a crash risk they all intersect. So the sheer scale of freight traffic on these corridors presents an incredible safety challenge. We cannot engineer our way out solely with asphalt. That we just cannot pave our way out of this. To improve safety, we must strategically shift, where possible, onto rail. That's a fact. And grade separated corridors designed for high volumes and fewer conflict points. When you take into account the population growth and the amount of freight that's projected to grow, the legislature has to focus on rail. Slide 6, please. Texas is home to the busiest international land freight port in the United States. That's the Port of Laredo, which accounted for 46% of all U.S.-Mexico freight value in 2024 at $282 billion. Other critical crossings like Isleta, Hidalgo, Brownsville also handle significant international freight volumes. And the connectivity to these ports, and from a safety aspect, rail is a true asset. Each rail container moved across the border reduces the number of heavy trucks queued on highways. Efficient rail leads shorten dwell times at crossings and reduce congestion, spill back onto local streets, and improve reliability just throughout the whole spectrum. The rail's role in the cross-border trade is not incidental, it is safety-centric. Slide 7, please. So, grade crossing separation and risk mitigation. In the Rio Grande Valley region, 3 to 5 at-grade railroad crossing incidents occur per year on average, with no fatalities reported from 2015 to 2019 in that period. This reflects a lower incident density compared to the statewide average. The region's crossing incident rate is approximately 1.20 incidents per 100 miles of rail, compared to 1.66 statewide, indicating both challenges and opportunities in target safety improvements. In other words, moving freight by rail isn't only efficient, it measurably reduces the risk of collisions for the traveling public. In 2023, the Texas Department of Transportation released the Texas Delivers 2050. It's a long-range plan that identifies 20 commercial international border crossings and 5 rail crossings in the core multimodal freight network, highlighting rail's integration into our logistics backbone. However, thousands of at-grade railroad crossings remain across our state, many in fast-growing urban and suburban contexts, and each represents a potential point of conflict between rail and highway traffic. So for rail professionals here, the data is clear. Grade separations reduce severe crashes, improve reliability, and eliminate unpredictable delays for both freight and emergency vehicles. I encourage continued investment in the systematic grade separation prioritization models using freight density, train frequency, historical crash data to optimize safety ROI across the network. If you'll go to slide 8 for me. Grade crossings, separation and risk mitigation is imperative. Moving forward, I also encourage the prioritization of funding and showing the economic impact between the correlation of funding on rail and safety, but also the economic impact across that it has, not only on Texas, but the entire United States. Slide 9, please. Tech-enabled safety, data control, and connectivity. So rail isn't static. It's becoming increasingly data-driven. Positive train control, PTC, and advanced signaling reduce derailment and collision risks. We all know this. So condition-based track and equipment monitoring allows predictive maintenance and fewer unplanned service interruptions. Connected infrastructure systems, which TxDOT is advancing on the highway side with projects like Texas Connected Freight Corridors, can be mirrored in rail communications to improve cross-modal situational awareness. We're already doing this, one aspect of it, we can do it in both. So policy must evolve with technology. With AI and the power of artificial intelligence, we're going to see major changes in rail. Ensuring that the regulatory frameworks enable that data sharing and safety innovation without compromising security of commercial viability. Trade secrets and commercial, recipes for how things are done need to be protected. But we also need to balance the necessity for privacy with safety. Slides 10 and 11, please. Passenger rail expansions, when aligned with freight planning, provide measurable safety benefits by reducing vehicle miles traveled on congested corridors. That just goes back to say, the more trucks we take off the road, the safer we are. Shifting commuters from highways with high crash rates to controlled environments and diminishing peak period for freight passenger interference zone. Mode separation improves corridor safety. Shifting commuters from mixed traffic highways to controlled rail environments reduces conflicts between passenger vehicles and also heavy freight traffic. Passenger rail strengthens system resilience. During incidents of weather events, major disruptions, rail provides a far safer alternative that maintains mobility without increasing the highway risk. So, passenger rail's safety dividend, slides 10 and 11. Passenger rails, when aligned with freight planning, provide measurable safety benefits by reducing vehicle miles traveled on congested corridors. When you talk about vehicle miles traveled, I believe that will be the future of how we deal with EVs not filling up the pump. So much of Texas highway funding is the gas tax, which is never indexed, and so its buying power is severely diminished. And with the proliferation of electric vehicles, you see less and less people at the pump, which means less and less money for highways. And so vehicle miles traveled, by reducing vehicle miles traveled, you reduce wear and tear on the roads, but you also reduce incidents of collision. Shifting commuters from highways with high crash rates to controlled rail environments only makes sense. And diminishing peak period, brief passenger interference zones does as well. So mode separation improves corridor safety. Shifting commuters from mixed traffic highways to controlled rail environments reduces those conflicts again. But passenger rail strengthens system resilience during incidents of weather as well. So slide 12, please. International trade. That's of extreme importance in this area, and one of the things that will be the future of international trade. Mexico is Texas's largest trading partner. Texas serves as the primary rail gateway between the U.S. and Mexico, linking Mexican markets to the Midwest, the Northeast, and the Mid-Atlantic regions. Our Gulf Coast ports and inland waterways further position Texas as a national leader in freight and intermodal transportation. So it takes all kinds. One of the leaders in intermodal transportation for Corpus Christi, they used truck, rail, and boat. Texas is a national leader in rail infrastructure and activity rankings, first in rail miles, freight rail employment, railroad retirement beneficiaries, and total rail tons terminated. We're the leader, but we can do so much more. There's so much more that needs to be invested, and it is imperative that the Texas Legislature take note of not only the population growth challenges, but the safety features and the bang for the buck, so to speak, the ROI. Third, in originated rail tons and total railroad carloads. So I see a bright future ahead for trade between the U.S. and Mexico. Mexico actually last year, I don't know what the current state is, but it was the United States' largest trading partner. In 2024, total trade between Texas and Mexico was $281 billion, with Mexico the state's top export destination and import source. Of that 30%, $88.8 billion is via rail, primarily at the ports of entry of Laredo and Eagle Pass. The West Rail Bridge in Brownsville accounted for $2.8 billion of trade in 2024, and it's the fourth busiest railroad crossing between U.S. and Mexico, which makes it extremely important. Trade between the U.S. and Mexico is increasing as companies are moving manufacturing back to the U.S. or nearshoring to Mexico. Texas has well been positioned to benefit from this global movement in trade, and the state must increase rail investment in the next legislative session. If the RGV is going to continue to capitalize on the investment in our region and global trends, the legislature must pay attention. So if you go to slide 13 for me. Passenger rail faces an uphill climb in the legislature, but some tangible wins on this issue give me some hope for the future. One such win was HB 483 by Representative Busey, which allocates state funding to support the development of high-speed rail linking Dallas, Austin, and San Antonio. And one day, hopefully the Valley. This bill was the furthest a bill supporting high-speed rail has ever made in the legislature. And as chair of the Transportation Funding Committee, I was proud to set this bill for hearing last April and vote for it in the Transportation Committee. Unfortunately, the bill died without being set for a vote on the House floor. But the fact that it made it as far as it did was very impressive. And I'll give you a parallel. So when I first got to the legislature, I supported a bill that reduced penalties for smaller amounts of marijuana to keep people in the workplace and not lose their jobs. And that bill didn't even get a hearing. And 3 sessions later, that same committee voted for the complete legalization of recreational marijuana 100%. And so the fact that this has made it out of a committee and moved forward is a monumental step in moving policy forward. So I tell you, don't be dismayed or discouraged. The fact that we saw this happen is truly monumental. Even though it died, seeing something make it that far gives us inspiration that hopefully we're getting the light on the subject that we need. So the bill actually received an 8-4 vote out of the Transportation Committee, but was never placed on the calendars. And it was heard in the Transportation Funding Committee on April 28, 2025. Slide 14, please. So a policy path for safety-centered rail investment. To capitalize on rail safety potential, we must prioritize funding for rail highway grade separations, cross elimination programs, and multimodal logistic hubs. Align freight and passenger rail planning with TxDOT's multimodal network strategies to build resilient corridors, and invest in intermodal connectors at key points of entry to smooth cross-border flows and reduce highway conflict exposures. We also must expand predictive and connected rail infrastructure technologies to build a safety-centric digital ecosystem. So in closing, rail's not a legacy system, it is a 21st century safety infrastructure system. Our challenge is to continue investing, collaborating, and building the infrastructure that connects the region with the rest of the state and cross-border. By investing in rail corridors, grade separations, advanced control systems, seamless border connections, we will reduce the crash risk, lower highway congestion, lower highway maintenance and preservation, and support transportation network that moves more freight and does so more safely. Together, we can ensure that the RGV remains the heartbeat of the U.S.-Mexico trade symbiotic relationship for generations to come, and that rail, passenger, and freight transport remains a major component of that goal. Thank you for having me. I greatly appreciate being here. I can tell you that you don't have a greater advocate for just logic, and logic is rail. Thank you.